Hello and welcome to episode 33. Sorry, I've been planning up to the 40 somethings already today, and I'm now finally recording episode 33. So, today's theme is medieval. It starts off because I've got a new book, which will be going in the medieval brew ships, which was supposed to be the week before this came out, but is now going to be the week after this the week that this comes out. And really, this is inspired to do a medieval theme session. Starting off with A Concise History of Warfare by Lord Montgomery. Yes, I've done this before, but it's a good book, and it's got some lovely pictures in it. And it's got a lot of, basically everyone winding up everyone else. Norman conquest going on, and this book was published in 1968 by William Collins and Sons, and this edition actually was published in 2000 by Wordsworth Editions. It's a good book, and it's got maps of the battles. If you don't mind, it's in black and white. It's not that color. It's not colourful, but hey, it's got some pretty good content in there, and I can't imagine it's that expensive on second hand. So, Concise History of Warfare, and we'll start off with Norman Conquest and Crusades, Chapter 7. The Vikings had been infantry soldiers. Their descendants, the Normans, became Europe's greatest exponents of heavy cavalry and strategic fortification. The great period of Norman expansion was the 11th century, followed by consolidation in the 12th. Two separate areas of their rule were established by conquest, southern Italy and northwestern Europe. The Normans imparted energy to Europe and played a leading part in the movement which expressed Europe's revived vitality. The Crusades. As it seemed to William of Malmesbury, they are a race inured to war and can hardly live without it. So many others could be like this. I'm surprised there hasn't been a sci-fi model on the Normans. To me, this part of our story is full of interest, since my family has its origins in Normandy. Falaise, of which I am a freeman, has many Montgomery memorials. Roger Montgomery, a cousin of the Conqueror, fought on the right wing of the army at Hastings, and curious enough, my old enemy, Ronald, received the wound which removed him from the Battle of Normandy, 1944, in the village of Steffroy de Montgomery, near Lisieux. He couldn't resist, could he? When I myself was commanding an army operating in the opposite direction to the one which Duke William had commanded. Balanced armies like those of the Eastern Roman Empire, composed of all arms, were not compatible with the feudal society. From the time of the defeat of the Anglo-Saxon axemen at Hastings in the 11th century to the rise of the Swiss and English infantry in the 14th, the mounted knight was regarded as the ideal soldier and the real backbone of an army. We shall find that the armies of the Crusades differed from a feudal army in that they contained more volunteers. They were also more incoherent because of the mixture of races and the jealousy and friction between the leaders. I found it difficult to raise any great enthusiasm over the operations of the Crusaders. The exploits of the Norman adventurers in the Mediterranean were daring and brilliant, but short-lived, and there is no space here to deal with them. The other great conquest by the Normans in the 11th century was England. In 1066, the year of his invasion and victory at Hastings, Duke William of Normandy had already ruled for 31 years. In the suppression of baronial revolts and in his conquest of Maine, he had already acquired a reputation as an able general, as a good tactician, but even more resourceful in strategy and ruses, and as a far-sighted, patient, and masterful ruler of men. William's expedition against England was not a raid on the spur of the moment, but a drive of expansion, long prepared and well practiced. In 1066, Harold, Earl of Wessex, was chosen as king by the National Council. But Harold was in no real sense a national leader, and William had as strong a theoretical claim to the throne as he did. William crossed the Channel in September, after 8 months of careful propaganda and preparation. The Norman threat was not the only one which Harold had to face that year. There was also danger in the north. Harold's brother, Tostig, had allied himself with the King of Norway. Harold had Rada, and a Norse invasion was possible. Harold reckoned that William's threat was by far the more serious of the two, so he called out the limited naval strength of his realm, and all through June, July, and August he maintained patrols in the channel between Dover and the Isle of Wight. At the same time, the earls and sheriffs were ordered to keep the militia of the realm, the Fyrd, ready for instant mobilisation. The Fyrd was the main strength of the English army, and was recruited on the basis of 1 man for every 600 acres. But it could be called out only for 2 months at a time. There was another class of fighting men called the Fens. They were above ordinary freemen in status, but below the aristocracy, and owed military service directly to the king. The English army fought on foot, the soldiers being armed with spear, javelin, two-edged sword, and a massive Danish axe. The shields were round or kite-shaped. All who were rich enough wore a metal helmet and coat of mail. The king had a personal force of professionals, the housecarls, and these waited with him in Sussex during the summer of 1066. To be honest, I'd add quite a lot of nobles had housecarls. If you were rich, you'd have them. That housecarls literally means soldiers of the house, pretty much. And they were usually very professional, and would be equally divided often between archers and very, very large axemen. It's a good book, though. Dan Jones, The Crusades, an epic history of the wars for the Holy Lands. This is a very cool book. I have got his other book, but this is one I've got, and this is the one I've had sent to me recently. On the second, this is chapter 12, A New Knighthood, and this was published in 2020, I think, 2019, by the head of Zeus Ltd. And this version was published in 2020 by the head of Zeus. This paperback edition is the new one. On the 2nd of May, 1125, King Baldwin II visited Acre. The fortified city, the seaside city, which sat on a small rocky peninsula north of the Bay of Haifa, was fast becoming the most important commercial hub in the Latin East. It was well connected by water and land to the rest of the Latin states, while pilgrims and merchants alike appreciated its harbour, sheltered from the waves by artificial walls sunk into the seabed during the rule of the 9th century Abbasid governor Ibn Talun, and protected from enemy shipping by a large chain which could be drawn across the entrance at night. Acre was a regular stopping point for kings of Jerusalem who claimed direct rule over the city and its environs, unlike most of the rest of the kingdom, which was granted out as feudal holdings to barons and vassals of the crown. Along with Jaffa, Acre was the most important entrepôt to the Crusader states in the 12th century. During his visit to Acre, Baldwin confirmed a charter that rewarded Domenico Michele, Doge of Venice, and his Crusader sailors for their part in the conquering Tyre the previous year. The sweeping privileges that had been promised to Venetians in return for their crusade, permission to set up a profitable, self-governing Venetian colony in Tyre, and to live according to their own rules and customs everywhere else in the Latin East, had originally been granted by Waramund, Patriarch of Jerusalem, because Baldwin was in jail. Now the king put his own seal to the agreement. In doing so, he ensured that the affairs of the Holy Land would be of interest to the Doges and citizens of Venice for generations to come. He acknowledged the need to be on amicable terms, not least because, after their assault on Tyre, the Venetians had sacked Byzantine towns throughout the Aegean and Ionian seas, launching a major attack on Rhodes and stealing the relics of St. Isidore from Chios. He confirmed his commitment to building a network of overseas supporters upon whom the kings of Jerusalem might call for military support, and furthered a policy of managing conquered towns by carving them up between various colonizing powers from afar. Baldwin's Treaty of Venice would prove to be extremely important in the history of crusading and the Crusader states, although the full consequences would not become clear for nearly 80 years. And tucked away at the end of the charter was another detail that would prove similarly significant both in the 1120s and beyond. The witnesses included a man called Hugh of Paynes, the first and founding master of the Order of the Poor Knights of the Temple of Solomon, or for short, the Templars. Dun dun dun. It's a very cool book. But this is supposed to be done in 15 minutes. And I'm already at 9 minutes 20. The Middle Sea. The History of Mediterranean by John Julius Norwich. Now, you cannot talk about the medieval period in terms of Europe, at least. Probably can in terms of China, without talking about the Mediterranean. Although, there again, you then have the spice trade. So maybe you can't talk about the medieval period without talking about the Mediterranean. You can give it a go. There is an option. Let's do the rival. The fall of... I've just talked about it. The fall of April. Okay. The War of Sicilian Vespers, for which Charles was largely responsible, was to continue well into the next century. It was not only Philip III, the Bold of France, and his son and successor Philip IV, the Fair, after him who were bound, for reasons of family honour, to recover the island so rudely wrenched away. There was also the fact that Sicily and the Regno had been granted to Charles by the Pope, so the papacy too had to look to its prestige. Pope Martin IV had promptly proclaimed a crusade against the Aragonese. King Philip, for his part, had begun to raise an army. But it took more than these two powers to overawe the House of Aragon and its faithful ally, the Republic of Genoa. From both sides of the dispute, diplomatic missions crisscrossed Europe until almost all the Mediterranean nations were to a greater or lesser degree involved. That exception, of course, was the Mamelukes of Egypt. They had little interest in Sicily. Their eyes were fixed on the lands of the Outer and the destruction of the Crusader states. Those states might have been saved, at least temporarily, if the Christian nations of the West had forgotten their other preoccupations and marched to the defence of their beleaguered co-religionists, but they did not do so. The first alarm was sounded, surprisingly enough, by the Mongols. In 1287, the Great Khan, now Hulagu's grandson Aragon, sent to the West a Christian ambassador, a certain Ravan Sama. He first visited Constantinople, then went on to Naples, Genoa, Paris, and Bordeaux, where King Edward I of England was in residence in his mainland capital. He returned via Rome. Everywhere he was accorded a royal reception. In Paris, Philip IV personally showed him around the Sainte Chapel to admire the sacred relics that his grandfather, St. Louis, had purchased from the Byzantine emperor. In Bordeaux, Edward, who was after all an old crusader himself, invited him to celebrate Mass with his court. In Rome, he received the sacrament from the hands of the newly elected Pope Nicholas IV. Everywhere he stressed the urgent necessity of an expedition to recover the holy places and to save Outremer. Everywhere he received a sympathetic hearing, but never once was he given a firm undertaking or a definite date. The old crusading spirit was gone. It would not return. The Great Khan found this difficult to believe. In the early summer of 1289, he dispatched to Europe another ambassador, a Genoese by the name of Pascal, with letters to the Pope, and the French and the English kings. Their impact must have been somewhat reduced by the fact that they were written in Mongolian, but Pascal was presumably able to translate. This time, Aragon went so far as to propose an alliance. He himself, he wrote, intended to lead an army of 20 to 30,000 horsemen. They had reached Damascus in mid-February 1291. If the two kings were prepared to send armies of their own, and the holy places were constantly recovered, he would be happy to hand them over. Alas, this initiative was no more successful than its predecessor. The Great Khan made one more attempt, but it too proved a failure, and by the time his envoys returned, he was dead. By this time, as if to confirm Aragon's worst fears, the Mameluke Sultan Qalan had moved his entire army into Syria. His pretext was to prevent the Genoese from taking over the county of Tripoli, as they were admittedly threatening to do, though there seems little doubt that his long-term objective was more sinister. Towards the end of March in 1289, he drew up his troops beneath the walls of Tripoli, and on 26 April, they swarmed into the city. Every Christian man they found was put to death, every woman and child carried off into slavery, every building burnt to the ground. Now at least the West began to take notice. Thanks to the urgings of Pope Nicholas, the Venetians, who had been delighted to see the Genoese deprived of Tripoli, but had now begun to fear for their own interests in Acre, sent 20 war galleys, which were joined by 5 from King James of Aragon. Unfortunately, however, this fleet was accompanied by a rabble of peasants and small-time adventurers from northern Italy, all of them out for what they could get. From the day of their arrival in Acre, they proved drunken, irresponsible, and one sweltering day in August 1290, they went on the rampage, charging through the streets and killing every Muslim they could encounter. Both sides are great here. Following the fall of Tripoli, Qalan had agreed a truce with the Christians. Had all gone well, they might have been able to enjoy a few more years of independence, but after the massacre at Acre, the truce had clearly ceased to exist, and there was no doubt left in the Sultan's mind. The Franks must be eliminated. On the 6th of March 1291, under his son and successor, Al-Sharif Kali, the great army once again sets forth. Its size was given to 60,000 cavalry and 160,000 infantry. A wild exaggeration, perhaps, but there can be little doubt that the Christians of Acre, of a total population of fewer than 40,000, some 800 knights and some 14,000 foot soldiers, including Venetians, Pisans, and the free military orders, would find themselves outnumbered many times over. I have a last book, and it's over 50 minutes, so I do apologise, but hey-ho. 1,000 Years of Annoying the French by Stephen Clarke. Go on. Let's do this one quickly. Henry V. Much more than a funny haircut. The wars dragged its heels when Edward III died at the ripe old age of 64 in 1377. It was only kept going because so many Englishmen wanted the chance to hop across the channel and make their fortune. Soldiering was as profitable a profession as modern-day football, with the added advantage that the opponents were likely to be hopelessly unfit peasants. But England was suffering internal revolt, and King Richard II, the Black Prince's son, the Black Prince had died, probably of cancer, before he could inherit the throne, sued for peace to France. In 1396, Richard even made an alliance with the French by marrying the new King Charles VI's 6-year-old daughter, Isabel. In 1398, he went one stage further and accepted a truce with France. Frustrated, Englishmen began to moan that Richard II was a closet Francophile, and this was one of the contributory factors to his being deposed in 1399, and so it was rumoured, poisoned in early 1400. In those days, you stopped annoying the French at your peril. The French themselves were not at all in favour of appeasement, and might not have accepted a truce if King Charles VI hadn't been a complete lunatic. He would often run around his castles howling like a wolf, and was convinced he was made of glass and that people wanted to smash him. In a fit of madness, he once killed 4 of his own courtiers. This weakness at the top split France into 2 families warring for power: the Burgundians, led by Charles VI's cousin, Jean de Bourgogne, and the Armagnacs, under Louis, Charles's brother. Soon both factions were committing atrocities that even outdid the chevauches. The Armagnacs created a new terror, the Ecoeurs, literally men who will skin you alive, that they inflicted on their own countrymen for a good 30 years. The only real winners of this long period of infighting were the English, who sold their support to first one faction and then the other, promising to intervene but switching loyalties when they were offered more money and territory by the opposing side. The biggest benefactor of all this was the new English king, Henry V, who in 1414 made a treaty with the Armagnacs that at one stroke earned him the regions of Poitou, Anjou, and Périgord in the southwest of France, thereby restoring at least partly England's old fortunes in that corner of the world. Henry V, who was only 26 when he succeeded the throne, was surrounded by very eligible male relatives and needed to prove that he was a strong monarch. He was a born fighter and wore his hair in the military pudding bowl style of a helmet, wearing knight rather than the flowing regal locks of his recent ancestors. It is said that he was tall and so strong that he could walk in armour as those wearing a light cloak, no doubt because he had been put into battle dress at an early age. While away persecuting Wales in his teens, he had been hit in the face by an arrow. He was still excellent shots, those Welsh archers, and was scarred for life, which is one of the reasons why his most famous portraits are all in profile. Unfortunately for the French, Henry was fanatically religious, and convinced that God wanted him to be King of France. He was also the first non-gay ruler of England since William the Conqueror. Not to have a string of mistresses. Another bad omen for his enemies across the French Channel. There are so many things to keep you amused if the king has enough mistresses. It's terrible. What's more, the French just kept offering themselves up for punishment. In 1414, the 2 warring factions, the Burgundians and Armagnacs, came to England asking for Henry's help. Henry replied by demanding the hand of a French princess in marriage, and while he was at it, the French crown. When this was refused, he retorted by saying they had no option but to prepare for war, omitting to mention that he had been recruiting troops and having cannons made for the past year. It's always so good when you get a pretext for war after you've already been preparing for war. It's just brilliant timing. He had also been planning the details of his invasion carefully, and like the Allied armies in 1944, chose to invade France via Normandy rather than the obvious route through Calais. On a sunny Sunday in August 1415, his fleet of 1,500 ships carrying over 10,000 fighters, as well as horses, cattle, and cannon, left the Solent. It must have been a colourful spectacle, with the knights' banners fluttering in the breeze, and Henry's own ship, the 540-ton Trinité Royal. Why he didn't give it an English name is not clear. Probably because, like most of the nobles at the time, he spoke French more than English, but we'll leave that to one side. Sporting a provocative royal standard similar to the one created by Edward III, combining English lions with the French fleur-de-lis. The mood among the soldiers was optimistic, especially when swans came to swim alongside Henry's ship. A good sign because his personal banner featured, in heraldic terminology, a swan with wings displayed argent. Oh, great. Henry's destination was the mouth of the River Seine at Harfleur. He landed there on around 14th August, and legend has it that in another parallel with William the Conqueror, disembarking, Henry tripped and fell to his knees. Like William, he reacted quickly, adopting the prayer position, and the choir on board his ship began singing, no doubt to cover up the royal mutterings of, "Oh no, I've got sand in my armour." The fleet was so big that it took 2 whole days to unload the ships. Stories that say this was because of a French dockers' strike are untrue, and that's a little footnote. Only when all his men had disembarked did Henry give them the bad news. This was to be no chevauche. Looting, massacring, and wholesale rape were forgiven. The English groan of disappointment was apparently heard as far away as Paris. However, they were consoled by the fact they were allowed to kill as many Frenchmen as they could find. Henry immediately set about besieging Harfleur and was annoyed to find that Normans had learned a thing or two since Edward III's unopposed raids. They built impregnable defences around the town, and the siege of this small port, guarded by only a few hundred troops, dragged on with the English losing alarming numbers of men, not just from cannon fire and crossbow bolts, but also because of disease. This said that the water was contaminated, and the chronicler John Capgrave wrote that many men died of fruit eating. French summer fruits were clearly too exotic for the meat and turnip Englishmen. Started to die, suffering from one contemporary protestly called a bloody flux. Probably dysentery. It wasn't until 22nd September that the town finally surrendered, and the English were able to go in and grab rich hostages. Henry spared the poor, valueless citizens of the town, and even let some of them stay there, or they gave all the posh houses to Englishmen. The problem for Henry was that, after a month in Normandy, about a third of his army was dead. A large number had to be sent home on sick leave, and several hundred would have to stay and defend Harfleur. He was forced to abandon his plan to attack Paris and decided instead to make a dash for the English stronghold of Calais, expecting no trouble in the way because his predecessors there had been made such a good job of devastating the countryside and emptying it of opposition. However, Henry's plan hit 2 major obstacles. The first was torrential rain that slowed his progress across the country. The second was King Charles VI of France, still nominally in charge of his country. Charles had been informed by escapees from the siege of Harfleur that Henry's invading force had shrunk to manageable proportions, and he quickly raised an army that headed out of Paris to cut off the English retreat. Our Frenchmen were at work harrying King Henry's men as they marched northeast, and the Brits were horrified to find that one river crossing after the other was either destroyed or blocked. They had to fight at every bridge and fjord and make an unplanned 70-kilometre detour inland before they could skirmish their way across the Somme. And then, just as English supplies, troops, and morale were at the lowest, the huge French army appeared. Shakespeare puts their number at 60,000, 300,000, though he was almost certainly exaggerating to talk up Henry's achievement. There are probably only 20 or 30,000 Frenchmen. Nevertheless, this was at least 4 times more than Henry's band of exhausted fugitives. French messengers came to Henry telling him, rather needlessly, that they intended to fight him and take revenge for his conduct. But instead of pleading that for once he had spared commoners' lives, not an argument that would have interested the snooty French nobility, Henry typically replied, "Be all things according to the will of God." Okay, this is the point at which the French should have got worried. His men camped that night in a rain-sodden field, probably unmindful of the fact that the rain-sodden fields had brought the English good luck at nearby Crécy 50 years earlier. As they sat in mud, they could see the French camp stretching away to the horizon, their fires blazing, the smells of expertly barbecued French sausages wafting over to torment the Englishmen, who had been living off wet bread, rotten fruit, and dysentery bacteria for the past week. In their hearts, Henry and his men are prepared to die. Battle, of course, that comes next is called Agincourt. Right then, so that was some medieval history. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm sorry this 4 random books is so long and so late. Take care.